afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Rochelle Tanner, visiting us from Chapman University. Rochelle earned her dual degree in environmental sciences and jazz piano performance at the University of Southern California. She went on to get her PhD in integrative biology at UC Berkeley. She then completed 2 postdoctoral positions, one in bioinformatics at Washington State University and one in ecosystem sciences at UC Davis. I was very lucky to get to know Rochelle and become her friend when we were both postdocs in Ann Todgem's lab at UC Davis in around 2020. Since 2021, she has been an assistant professor at Chapman, where she is jointly appointed in the Humanities and Sciences Colleges within the Environmental Science and Policy Program. Very impressively, within just a couple of years, she was appointed department chair. Dr. Tanner's research is dedicated to serving society with a focus on the sociological impacts of climate change on nearshore communities. When she's not conducting research, running a department, or composing jazz music, Rochelle is also an incredible baker. Her scones are the best you'll ever try. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rochelle Tanner, who will be presenting her talk titled Participatory Science for Nearshore Management Solutions, How Prioritizing People Over Data Leads to Novel and More Equitable Research Directions. Thank you, Rochelle.
Thank you, Christina. Can you hear me? All right. So I'm super happy to be here. I was telling Christina that the last time I was out at BML was over a decade ago when I was in grad school at Berkeley, and that just makes me feel really old. But I'm glad to be back, and it's great to see all the work that all of you are doing here. So as a true humanities professor these days, I only teach humanities classes now. I wanted to start with a quote from Restoring the Kinship Worldview, a book by Four Arrows and Dr. Garcia Narvaez, as the primary text in my environmental justice course, which I am currently missing the lecture for to be here today. So the authors outline 28 precepts for rebalancing life on planet Earth, one of which is recognizing that all Earth entities are sentient. In other words, relationships between humans, plants, and animals, and the Earth itself are vital to our well-being. In this section, they discuss the work of Robin Kimmerer, which I know some of you may be familiar with. She is one of the leading scholars in relational indigenous ecology. And Four Arrows ends this chapter's discussion with, if universities cannot show people how to understand the world as a gift, then we must take it upon ourselves. And this really resonates with how I see the historical role of higher education in science, and now climate change science. We pour our efforts into answers, but we're not finding the questions in an equitable way to begin with. And for me, I find my research experiences, or research questions in my own experiences. These are some of mine from the last year, taking my Chapman students all around California, taking on our natural wonders. They're no doubt the reason that I pursue the research I'm really passionate about. I see something worth protecting in these ecosystems, as I'm sure you all do too. But I and the relatively few others who study these ecosystems shouldn't be solely responsible for driving the scientific field and, by extension, the political legislation forward. Millions of people recreate and live on these ecosystems, and we don't hear their voices. And so in the core tenet of my research program, I ask this question, and I tell my students that we have a responsibility to protect our natural environment, but we need to do this in a way that's equitable and in a way that allows the public effective personal agency to participate in a meaningful way. Now, usually when I have this talk with natural scientists or biophysical scientists, I start with a definition of personal agency, because this is not something that we think about a lot, because we have a lot of privilege in a place of higher education. And when I talk about personal agency, I think about it on the spectrum of from this idea of I experience things that are done to me in the world and I can't do anything about it, all the way to I can change how things are in the world and how other people experience the world. And these are underlaid by aspects like education, literacy, access to money and resources, which then trickle down to either high or low psychological or physical stress. And another important thing in personal agency is the amount of community that you have around you that shares common values and ideas. And so we apply this in my work because some people don't even realize that they rely on their natural environment because they have a lack of education or literacy around the topic, not necessarily overall, but just about natural environment, and limited access to resources in the community to remedy that. And so this doesn't mean that they don't deserve a voice in the conversation, they just need help getting access to that conversation. So why should we care about other people's personal agency? You know, we have a lot going on. I would say that it's really important to understand and empathize with other people who are impacted by our science because we can directly address needs and questions that society has. And it can lead to more novel findings because there's so few scientists and so many more people who have a stake in what we study. So we're currently biasing the research topics and scientific innovation with our own curiosities and our lived experiences, which is not a bad thing, but we need input from other people on how to do better science that more equitably represents who is being impacted by it, because it's not usually us. The next question that I normally get, especially from students, is, well, does the public even want to be doing this with us? Are they engaged in the science that we're doing? You know, my parents think that I do this really esoteric thing that they don't understand anything about and they don't want anything to do with. And to that I say, there is a lot of evidence out there that shows that people are not only willing, they are very hungry for this type of engagement. We are at almost or over 16 billion visitors to national parks. During COVID, we saw a 7% increase in public outdoor activities. And we're also surpassing millions of observations on iNaturalist, and a lot of the Pew Research studies on the social dynamics of our society show that people really care about environmental quality and climate change. They just don't talk about it. And so there is this need for public engagement in science, but we're not doing a really good job of allowing those pathways to form. So this is where something called participatory science comes in. And you may have heard of something called citizen science or community science. And there's one really key difference between the two fields. And I know this is a jargon difference, but this is particularly important in the social sciences where this field was developed. And the goal of participatory science is to involve members of an affected community in the research design, development, collection, and application throughout the process of research and the application of it that comes before publication. It's not a concept where the public will contribute data to a research project for no benefit. Benefit does not include just being part of research, that's not a benefit. Being outside is not a benefit, they can do that themselves. And it happens in a community where researchers, they put in the effort to build relationships with the community outside of the research they're doing. And this type of participatory science takes a lot of time. It doesn't start with a grant proposal or a research program. It starts with a conversation over a cup of tea, an introduction between mutual colleagues, running into someone at a farmer's market. This type of science builds relationships years before the science actually starts. And going too quickly into it results in more extractive projects that can exacerbate community distrust in science, even if governmental agencies are pushing for it. And so this is what makes it a really difficult field, but it's also what makes it something that we should all be striving for in our work, at least for a portion of our work. And for me, this is kind of the impotence behind why I only do participatory science in my research lab. I have a very traditional background in evolutionary physiology, but after graduate school and a couple of postdocs, I decided that the research in my lab would not go forward unless we had a community member or a community partner that was asking us to do this work and benefiting directly from it. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories of how that looks, because I know that sounds kind of overwhelming of like, how do I do this? And we're going to start up here in the Bay Area, which I still work a lot up here. and then we'll go down to Southern California, where I work now, and then look at the beginning of a California-wide study that we're doing. But before I go forward, I just want to acknowledge that given that, like Christina said, all my time is taken up by being the department chair and all this other administrative stuff that I have to do, so I really need to thank all of the lab technicians and postdocs and students who were the people who did the boots on the ground work, some of whom are actually still at UC Davis. So the first story that I want to tell you about is about coordinated management of invasive species in the California Delta. Sassoon Marsh is the brackish part of the California Delta, the lost child of the Delta because it's not freshwater, but it's still super important. And so in this project, which has been funded by the Delta Council now for 4 years, we were working with landowners and land managers, which is a mix of private and public entities, in helping them allocate financial, time, and space resources to effectively keep Phragmites australis at bay, which is this really tall reed plant. It's about 15 feet tall, really dense to move through. It creates a lot of monoculture. It can be, harmful for the ecosystem in terms of blocking physical boundaries to certain parcels of land. And we addressed 3 things in this project. We addressed whether you needed to spend the resources in the first place, which is something that no one had looked into yet, surprisingly. And this is something that we spend billions of dollars on. We also looked at, well, if we're going to do management, where should it be prioritized spatially? And then we also looked at how to broach the conversation with diverse landowners and land managers about this issue, knowing that they had different values and feelings about the value of this plant and how they wanted to manage the land. So how do we get everyone on the same page for a coordinated management plan when everybody feels a different way? So this is the way that I've been presenting this to the agencies in a very short and sweet method. So we operate under this null assumption that Phragmites is bad because it's introduced and it's really tall and it's hard to get through. But when we look at the actual ecological and physiological data, we see that Phragmites fosters a cooler, less variable environment that significantly increases the body quality of a food source for listed fish's diet. And I can show you a graph. Plot. Well, the next slide is probably a big file, and that's why it's not going forward. But it is a graph, there it is. It's a graph of temperatures under different canopies in Sassoon Marsh. The blue is Phragmites canopies, and the red are canopies of native plants like trees. And what you can see here is throughout the year, Phragmites fosters a cooler and less variable environment, which you can imagine is creating a climate refuge for the things that live underneath it. And we did an assay of the biochemical energy stores in amphipods that live under these conditions, both in the lab and the field. And we found that if they grow up under the Phragmites canopy, they are significantly higher quality food sources. And so this means that, maybe we need to be thinking about keeping Phragmites in our canopy of a restored ecosystem that's going to be undergoing climate stress. The next thing that we found that was shocking was that Phragmites had no significant detrimental impacts on community composition for this ecosystem. And again, that is just not what we would expect for an introduced plant that operates in monoculture. But what we found was these are some NDMS plots that we pulled together. We're not quite done with the data analysis, but it represents over 2,000 samples across 3 sites surveyed monthly in 2021 in pelagic, benthic, and terrestrial environments. And what we're seeing here in the black circles, all the dots are gone. In the black circles are the Phragmites populations in these NDMS plots. And you can see that they're right in the middle of all of the different native plants that we also surveyed. And so what we found was that there are no significant differences among these invertebrates. and native vegetation communities, what Phragmites is able to, or not able to exclude from the biodiversity. So that's encouraging. We also found that Phragmites provide shelter to listed bird species that actually prefer it because of its tall branching stalks. Native plants don't have that. You can see here that the Phragmites canopy not only has more, they have greater or equal Shannon-Weiner diversity indices, which is a measure of biodiversity. And this was really important to people who own and manage land in marsh because this is a community of primarily duck hunters. And so birds are things that they really care a lot about. And so all of this together meant that our main recommendation to the Suisun Resource Conservation District and the Delta Science Council was that please don't get rid of this. It is serving a really important ecosystem function, especially under climate change. But you need to fragment it in a way that preserves the connectivity of different native canopies. And we need to do this in a fiscally responsible way to retain the ecosystem services, but also manage other native communities that need to thrive in this area. So that led us to the challenge of spatial prioritization. This is not a new concept. This is something that we do for natural resource governance all over California, all over the world. And the reason we do this is we want to prioritize where we spend resources to target high-risk areas. And this is usually used in adaptive management. And the way that we approach spatial prioritization of Phragmites control was a little bit different than how it's been done in the past. In the past, you would see information like on the left here with biophysical information, you would see that as the primary data set for spatial prioritization. It would lean heavily on the natural sciences, the biophysical sciences, for us to understand what are the physical constraints of managing the species. But in this project, we placed an equal, if not more, level of importance on social information, how people interacted with each other, how they viewed the recreational and management potential and value of their land. And we even asked questions about how willing they were to cooperate with their neighbors and how they felt about their responsibility to their neighbors. So if they were the reason that their neighbors had an invasive species, did they feel bad about it or not? We took all that information and overlaid it onto an existing map of Phragmites on the whole of Suisun Marsh, which our colleague who is now a PhD student at Michigan prepared in his paper, and he found areas that were of high density throughout the marsh so that we could do some little case studies. So we're looking at Chips Island and Hill Slough, if you're familiar with the Delta in those cutouts there. And this is just the distribution of Phragmites before we apply our prioritization model. So it's kind of everywhere. When we put the model on it, you're gonna see it shrink a little bit because some areas are not highly prioritized. This is a prioritization map that it kind of follows the methods that are currently being used that prioritize public land and use that biophysical information. So basically this is saying where there's more Phragmites, spend more resources, and only do that where the state owns the land. So these are like Cal Fish and Wildlife and DWR properties. And so this is kind of how it's being done right now. But we posed a lot of other scenarios with a lot of input from our landowners to kind of envision a different spatial prioritization. And we developed a tool for them to do this prioritization on their own using some toggles, but these are just kind of some scenarios that were commonly brought up. This one over here is just weighting biophysical dynamics and both private and public land. You can see that it still shows up on Chips Island, but everything else is kind of spread out, and it actually says we don't really need to prioritize very much of it at all. But when we heavily weight the social dynamics of how people interact around coordinated management, the map completely shifts, and you can see way more prioritization on the western side of Suisun Marsh, where apparently these landowners are really invested in making sure that they are participating in very neighborly behavior. They care about the people around them and protecting everybody else's land. So you can imagine when you look at spatial prioritization this way, with community input, this completely changes where you want to allocate resources, and kind of changes the game for not only the control of the species, but how we're going to go about it and where we're going to just leave it. Now, that was kind of the first step of this project, getting community input in the design and the development of the project, right? Now we want to make sure that we have their input in the application. And a huge part of this for my lab is working on strategic communication. And the role of evidence-based communication is huge when we're talking about coordinated management. This is something that we don't spend a lot of effort on. And it comes from the science of framing and the science of cognitive science and environmental psychology. It relies on cultural values that predict and shape human decision-making and behavior. So we can actually pinpoint specific words and phrases that lead people to make certain decisions. And we can use these phrases to drive sense of belonging to a community so that people feel more inclined to do certain things. Now, we also do research about who should be delivering these messages because it really depends on who you hear that information from. And the primary literature shows again and again that scientists are not the trusted messenger in this scenario. We're trusted by almost no one in society. Government agencies are kind of our only friend in this arena. And so we looked at a lot of different types of government agencies and community organizations that these landowners might trust. And we evaluated their shared cultural values, and we found that if the organization had moderate management power, so they could disperse resources, and low regulatory power, they had the highest amount of trust. And this happened to be the Resource Conservation District in the area, which is not surprising because it was developed by the landowners themselves. So these are some of the specific words that we tested, and I know it's kind of small, so I'll just run through the themes of them, but we found that if you talk about cultural values that have to do with protection, stewardship, and responsible management, you're significantly more likely to get people to buy into what you're about to say next than if you use arguments related to economics and fiscal responsibility. And when we were doing this, we used specific phrases that we found on agency websites that were being used to kind of generate buy-in to programs. And we found some that should work really well psychologically and others that we would recommend removing from the website. So that was really useful for the Delta Council to hear. Now, the overall findings from this is kind of, it depends who you talk to kind of message. Different stakeholders, they need that literacy building step of kind of breaking down why it's important to care about invasive species and what we need to be doing about it. But starting with those community level values over financial benefits increases buy-in significantly from a psychological, non-rational thought perspective. We also uncovered some other things that we didn't think we were going to be working on this project, which is where we're going next. We found that there is almost no intergenerational planning, which can jeopardize long-term collective action, because as soon as these landowners retire or pass away, they'll need to make sure that their predecessors have those same relationships with their neighbors in place. We also found that they don't actually know what invasive species look like. We did a choice experiment where we gave them lots of different pictures, and they couldn't pick out the invasive species, even though they said that they knew how to identify them on their land. And so this is something that we're following up on with workshops. We're also looking into the use of social media to improve trust between managers and users of public lands in a future iteration of this work, and we're really excited to keep working on this. This is what I started my work on at UC Davis, and I did not expect to still be working on it. All right, so I'm really excited to talk about this project in Southern California, because this is kind of something that we started from scratch in my lab when I started at Chapman, and we're finally finished with it. But this project was about climate advocacy, and working with my students and observing the local environment in inland Orange County, which is where Chapman is, I noticed that there are a lot of people who, they live less than 30 minutes from the coast and they've never been there, and they don't understand how it relates to their personal lives. And my students really wanted to address this. And so we found an opportunity with a California Sea Grant Inclusive Research Training grant to kind of tackle this project in a pilot. And we wanted to make sure that multilingual community members, specifically the ones that don't speak English, knew how to get involved with climate advocacy that was impacting their daily lives. And we wanted to do this in an engaging way so that they could feel that sense of place-based belonging at the coast and know that this was a place that they could come during heat waves, which in Southern California are increasingly a really big problem. And we're having a lot of heat-related deaths and hospitalizations in urban areas because of this. And so this is one of the only areas, the coastline, that is available for those cooling benefits. So in this project, and this is very selfishly because I study sea slugs, we decided to focus on sea slugs. And this is partially because the students adore them and they think that everybody should adore them. But also through our not very scientific market research on TikTok, people are horrified and fascinated by them, and it is largely responsible for our cult following on TikTok. And so we decided that, you know, let's focus this program on something that people are really excited to find, and that it feels like a little scavenger hunt when they're going out there, and we can kind of funnel in other educational material as we teach them about nudibranchs. We also did some analysis on iNaturalist to look at whether people actually cared about nudibranchs, and the answer is yes. There's over 40,000 observations of nudibranchs in Southern California, which is drastically above any other group of species. There's hundreds of thousands of observations worldwide, and there's about 800 people that contribute the majority of these observations. So cult following. We also did an analysis that I don't have up here looking at the demographics of those people. And as you can imagine, the demographics of people who use iNaturalist tend to be majority white, majority female, actually. But these tend, as you can imagine, to not be people who don't speak English. So we want to broaden this community because we think that everybody should have a chance to learn. Now, we also did some fundamental biology research behind this, because it turns out that when they are the size of your fingernail, they're really hard to find, even though they're really brightly colored, which is kind of why they have this cult following. It's like a hunt for them. People love that. So we did 2 years of fundamental science on how do you find a nudibranch, or as my students like to say, what is the nudibranch vibe? They always told me that I had this innate ability to go find a nudibranch, and I just kind of knew where they were, and they wanted to figure out what that was, what the multivariate characteristics that predict whatever's going on in my brain so that they could find it too. So we looked at a ton of different things, both in the lab, in the field, and I'm showing you some of the most important things that came out of this study. We also looked at their physiology, which I'm not presenting on at all, but you can ask me about it. It's also fascinating. We looked at their behavioral thermoregulation between tide pools, whether they moved as the heat waves progress. And it turns out that there is a quantitative multivariate aspect to this nudibranch vibe. They're more likely to be found on the seaweed species that have a higher thermal inertia. That is statistically significant. So we picked out about 5 of those species. So that's just things like Egregia, Sargassum, giant kelp. Nudibranchs prefer them. And we also looked at their antagonistic relationships with known predators, or at least they don't like to exist in the same place. Things like sea anemones, sea urchins, hermit crabs. Interestingly, they don't care about the temperature of the tide pool, but they do care how deep the tide pool is, which has something to do with the volume of it. And so all of this primary fundamental science information that my students developed helped us develop a better participatory science curriculum that was engaging and resulted in more successful wins for participants. They felt confident when they found a sea slug, and they learned alongside, what they learned alongside those tools became more ingrained. So what we taught them about climate advocacy when they were out hunting for slugs became more ingrained for them. Now, back to that trusted messenger thing. So in this study, our trusted messengers were the students themselves. These students that were recruited to this program came from the local area. It was a requirement. They also had to speak another language as their first language, either Spanish, Mandarin, or Vietnamese. And a lot of these students came from community colleges, but some came from Chapman. They developed participatory science programming using our existing educational materials and that primary literature that they developed. And they created some of the first intertitle-focused climate education curriculum in Mandarin and Spanish. At 19 is a pretty big feat. And they did this not through direct translation. They did this through a translation of the cultural signaling that's present in the language that we use that's tested for appealing to cultural values and appealing to that non-rational thought. And so they did some really complex translations that they worked with their family and friends to make sure that they were capturing the essence of what it means to feel passionately about the environment. And the reason we spent so much effort on this is because science literacy is a really big solution for equitable climate action. Educational level is the biggest predictor of environmental concern and action worldwide. And when we use hopeful language based in strategic communication and shared cultural values, you can significantly improve the community involvement in climate action. And this project wouldn't have been successful without buy-in from our local climate and environmental advocacy groups, Climate Reality Project, Citizen Climate Lobby, and a really small local group called Perform and Sustain. And they came onto this project not because they represented the community, the multilingual communities, but because they represented the advocacy groups that were struggling to reach these multilingual communities to be able to represent their interests fairly when they advocated at city council meetings and in decisions about propositions at the state level. And so we helped to bridge this trust using students. And that was really successful for us. The curriculum, which I'm happy to share if you want it, we just make it freely available after we're done, was based on this approach that I've been using for many years that was created by the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. And it follows this format where you introduce things with a cultural value, you use metaphors to explain science, and then you always end with a community level sleep. And what we found in this project was that, unsurprisingly, literacy around the climate and living in a coastal area was really low, but it was really important to community members. So even though they answered questions about literacy as saying they weren't sure about anything, they really resonated with questions about, would you like to have more opportunities to take action for climate change? They overwhelmingly said yes, even our control group, which was random people that we just picked up off the beach. They also said they were interested in learning more about nudibranchs, even if they didn't know what it was, they wanted to know. And after the program, they were more likely to say that they wanted to reach out to one of the advocacy organizations that we had partnered with and participate in programs that they had put on. And so this was really encouraging for us because the people that we recruited to this did not know really anything about the coastal environment beforehand, but they still wanted to learn about it. And there was an even more stark difference in Spanish-speaking respondents, even though it's not statistically significant, but the error bars are much tighter, and it was just yes, they wanted to learn more. So we're really missing a community that desperately wants to be engaged in our research and just doesn't have the avenue to do so. We also looked at metrics of community engagement and community building. So we acknowledge that we're not always going to be there to be the facilitators of this. We need to make sure that this is a self-sustaining effort beyond our limited funding project. And so we asked questions about things like, today's event made me feel like part of a community. Today's event helped me become more engaged, more with the environment and the community. It introduced me to new people and new organizations. And all of these, overwhelmingly, the respondents said that they strongly agreed with it. And this is about 80 people. And so this is significant in that people walked away from a 2-hour experience with people they had never met thinking, I feel more connected to the people around me and that they're committed to the same outcomes for environmental protection that I am. And that's all based on things that I learned during this program. And so they didn't just build literacy, they build community. And this was a great outcome for us. We couldn't have hoped for a better outcome of this program. And so what this taught us was that, oh, this is sideways now, it's fine. We need to do more basic science research to provide more engaging curriculum that makes people feel like they can do science and they can be part of our work without us having to dumb it down. Like, we had to look into the very complex multivariate relationship between biotic and abiotic factors in nudibranchs to be able to tell people where to go find them. And then we had to be able to relate that to how they felt in their home environment, which is full of concrete, to, when they find a tree that's shady, that's how nudibranchs feel when they find egregia. We had to do a lot of research to be able to do that. And so participatory science is not less difficult, it's not less novel, it actually requires a lot more work, and it pays off. The last story that I want to tell you is about a project that is near and dear to my heart, and especially my former lab tech's heart. We had an experience on a beach in Southern California where someone who was appointed by the city told us that we didn't belong there. And that's something that, a lot of people experience, people of color experience along all of our coasts. And, we had all the permits to be there and we were wearing all of our matching gear and our little clipboards, but because of the color of our skin, we were not, seen as people who belonged in Newport Beach. And this was something that my students felt very strongly about, and they said, well, what can we do? And we went to our climate advocacy groups, and they said, yeah, we know about this problem. Would you like us to take it to city council? And I said, well, let's think about this first. How can we do a better job of making sure this doesn't happen more structurally, more systemically? And what you're supposed to do in that scenario is to talk to the California Coastal Commission, which I did, talk to my colleague, Laura, and she said, yes, we can report it, but we won't do much about it. And I said, well, what if you had an entire state's worth of data to show that this was a structural problem? And she said, maybe then. And so that's what we're doing now. This is something that we're not doing in huge collaboration with the community because we want to make sure that we're getting an unbiased result. We don't want to tell too many people that we're doing this because we are surveying public officials without their knowledge of the study to see whether there are disproportionate differences in how people are treated in their access to public spaces specifically. And so we want to ask this question because especially in Southern California, there's a rise in these illegal signs that say that beaches are private property. As all of you know, anything below the upper mean tide line is not private property. And we specifically want to look at whether there are disparities in how beach access and safety are perceived. So not only are people of color not accessing the beach, are they doing it because they're being told to leave, or are they doing it because they feel unsafe because of how people or processes have made them feel? And through all of this, what we are creating is a series of reports for the California Coastal Commission to better enforce state laws about public access to beaches. Because it's not condoned by the state, but it's really difficult to kind of top-down enforce things on the city level, especially in Southern California. And our survey results are showing some really preliminary things. So we are nowhere near done with this study, but I just wanted to pull out a few things. These are survey results from about 500 people across California. And most people live within an hour of the beach, pretty close. And they visit about once per year, which is kind of a shame because the beach is great. There are no apparent disparities in demographic categories, at least with our survey data here. And if we translate that further, we also looked at how people perceived being excluded from beaches. We asked questions about whether certain types of people have ever asked you to leave a beach or someone made you feel like you didn't belong. And what we see down here, I know there's a lot of colors, but we're seeing the dot that it's very closest to, this never happens to me, either of those, is unsurprisingly white. And the dot that is furthest away from that, so it's more likely to have happened to someone, includes the demographic category of an Indigenous person. And so that is not, this is not surprising to us, but it gives us more quantitative evidence to go to the Coastal Commission and tell them that there is systematic discrimination going on. We also looked at whether people attended events at the beach, which can be an indicator of whether they feel comfortable to assemble in a group and take advantage of public events that they have a right to go to. Fewer than half of our respondents have ever attended events. So this also poses a really big gap for people like us who do a lot of public outreach at beaches and intertidal zones. You know, people are not going to these. This is like ever in their lives. So this is, the respondents answered whether they had ever gone in their life. So they had gone at least once. And it's mostly white people, that's this maroon color. And you know, this is a really big opportunity for us, and I think this is something that we're currently looking into the research for beyond, which I can't tell you as many details about because of the IRB. But we're basically looking into whether there are disparities in who is allowed to organize these events and thus who feels welcome to attend them. And you know, all of these, this project is kind of a passion project for us, but I think it really represents the ethos of my lab and how the students feel empowered to ask questions that really benefit their community. And you know, there are even students in my lab that they're from the local area, and joining my lab was the first time they'd ever been to the coast. So this is kind of a passion project for me, and I'm really excited to learn more about it. I just want to end with saying that hopefully I've shown you that this responsibility to protect our natural environment needs to include everyone, and participatory science can really help reduce inequities in who has this literacy and who has the personal agency to make a difference. By doing this kind of science, we can help other people be part of the journey that we're trying to go along. And so hopefully you've at least taken one thing away that you can do in your own research. And I'm happy to take.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, for an amazing talk. First, we'll take questions in the audience. Anyone has them?
Hello, thanks for an awesome talk. I was wondering for your access study, have you had a chance yet to compare your sample population with demographics of either, you know, land owners or communities or even the general California population? The reason I ask for context because I think many of us in this room know that if you were to make a similar plot for folks that have been told they don't belong when they are trying to conduct research in the intertidal zone, it would map very similarly to your plot. And I would argue that if you compare that to the demographics of BML, you would get near 100% representation of folks that have been harassed or told to leave their field site. So I'm just curious what that looks like against that broader context.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. So I, as a newly born social scientist, have discovered survey platforms that automatically control for demographic representation. So I do know that it is a representative sample of California, but that's all that they were able to guarantee us. Land ownership. But at least it's representative for California.
Okay, as we wait for more questions, I have a question. I think you mentioned that tide pool depth was the biggest predictor of ring density and not compared to temperature. Do you discuss why that might be?
Yeah, so that's probably more related to the physiology data that we have. So basically, nudibranchs can withstand such high temperatures that, and this is something that I looked into in my PhD, that I don't think that they're under positive slope, or at least the acute exposure to temperature exposure. And depth is a proxy for volume. So it's a bigger tide pool, there's more resources available. It's that, but they do not seem to care how hot it is. They'll stay there forever.
The nudie vibe, is that something you've had forever? Did that come with experience?
That came with way too many field days, grad school, but I think I stopped far earlier than that. I desperately wanted to see it, didn't find one, and then that led me to do an entire PhD on them. So now I know how to find them.
Thanks, Rochelle. So I was interested in the first part of your talk. It was really interesting to see the positive benefits of Phragmites. And I could imagine that is a controversial conclusion. And I guess I'm wondering, are there some negatives of Phragmites? For example, when you have these big monocultures of Phragmites, what does it replace? Like, is it crowding out native vegetation?
Yes, so there are definitely negatives. I just never talk about them because people, like, that's what they walk in with, their status quo is like, this is a horrible thing. So it crowds out native vegetation, but I think the thing that people are most concerned about is that it fills in secondary and tertiary channels, tidal channels, which reduces access for fishes, which is the only thing that we actually in the success of the tidal restoration project. So that's the main thing. One benefit that was already acknowledged by managers is that because it rapidly accretes sediment, it can actually be really good for protecting levees. But they had said, well, if we put it on the levee, it's just going to be everywhere. But it's mostly, yeah, basically like removing tidal area.
Thank you, Rochelle. Follow-up question to Eric about Phragmites. There's this fairly large-scale, somewhat coordinated effort to restore bulk belt canopy throughout Northern California. And I think the approach being taken there is to find individual or cultivate populations in labs of individuals that are all genetically similar. I think on Marine Reserve here, whenever we're doing like planting or trying to get do species restoration, all kind of within this very tightly controlled, has to be very specific to the area. And in talking about Phragmites, where you mentioned that it's an invasive species, but does provide ecosystem services under a changing climate, do you think that researchers and land managers should be more open to not just trying to recreate the way something was, trying to take advantage of the way it is now or could be forward?
Yeah, I think it's less controversial, but maybe it's a little controversial how I feel about it, and that, maximizing ecosystem function, changing climate should be our top priority. And fortunately, that means that some species are not that, and maybe we find other ways that biodiversity, but it's a really good point. I think we're grappling with that in the Delta a lot. Can't put it back. And so we have to look at what the future is going to look
Hi, great talk for all these projects. I am curious about if your process before the research slide, how do you determine which partners you develop with? What is the workflow for?
So how do I choose who we do the work with? Is that the question?
Yeah. What is the process starting this part?
Yeah, so I was talking about this at the student lunch. It's like years of just creating relationships first before there's a specific grant that comes up, and then we go from there. But usually I'll extend an invitation to all of the community partners that I think have a stake, and then ask them whether they have the bandwidth to sign on. And if they don't, I ask them more details about, well, why don't you think you have the bandwidth? Can I alleviate that barrier by giving you a staff member through this? And it's kind of up to them on whether they want to do something. The government agencies, as you probably all have these experiences, are a lot more forward with like asking for help. But I almost never hear from our community organizations directly on like asking for a particular project because they just don't even have an idea of what is fundable. And their like needs have been ignored for so long that there's money out there to problem. And so I try and just build relationships so that they have regular conversations about what they need. One of my colleagues in environmental health, he established an advisory board, and this wouldn't work as well in some fields. I don't think this would work for me because I work in too many different areas, but he works in one particular area of environmental health, and he meets quarterly with all of his community partners, and they just talk about the things that are really bothering them and that their stakeholders are asking for, and then he goes back and says, okay, I'm going to look for funding. And so that's the way he does it. But yeah, there's lots of ways to do it.
Any more questions? Awesome. Thank you all for joining. Thank you everyone on Zoom for joining. And thank you, Rochelle, so much for an amazing talk. We will meet at 4:30 in the South Lounge for Wind Down Wednesday. So please come join us for some snacks and refreshment and wonderful discussion. Thank you.